Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. By October 1968, the Vietnam War had reached a critical and horrifying phase. The conflict, which had begun years earlier with escalating tensions, had turned into a brutal and unrelenting struggle that seemed to consume everything in its path. The jungles of Vietnam, once verdant and teeming with life, had become a nightmarish maze of death and destruction. American forces were entrenched in a war they struggled to understand and a landscape that was as unforgiving as the enemy they faced. The enemy, the Viet Cong, was elusive, blending into the jungles and villages with terrifying ease. They were masters of guerrilla warfare, using the terrain to their advantage, setting deadly traps, and launching ambushes that left American soldiers on edge, never knowing where or when the next attack would come. But it wasn't just the physical dangers of war that took a toll on the soldiers. The psychological burden was immense. The oppressive heat, the constant threat of ambush, the sight of comrades being maimed or killed, all of this wore down even the strongest of men. Soldiers lived in a state of perpetual fear, their nerves frayed by the incessant drone of insects, the rustle of leaves that could signal an approaching enemy, or worse, an encounter with something not of this world. The war had changed them. Young men who had once been filled with optimism and hope now walked with hollow eyes, their spirits crushed under the weight of what they had seen and done. They had seen villages destroyed, civilians caught in the crossfire, and friends turned into lifeless bodies in the blink of an eye. Each mission, each patrol into the dense, unforgiving jungle could be their last. It was during this harrowing period that reports of strange occurrences began to surface. Tales of ghostly apparitions, mysterious sounds, and unexplained events became more frequent among the troops. These stories were often dismissed as the result of stress, fatigue, or the soldiers' minds playing tricks on them. But for those who experienced these phenomena, the fear was all too real. In this crucible of war, where the lines between life and death, sanity and madness, had blurred beyond recognition, Bravo Company was about to embark on a mission that would take them deep into the heart of darkness. It was a mission that would not only test their courage, but would push the boundaries of their sanity. As October 3, 1968, dawned, the men of Bravo Company prepared for what they thought would be another routine patrol. But the jungles of Vietnam held secrets, dark and ancient, that had been awakened by the violence and bloodshed of war. The soldiers were about to confront horrors that went far beyond the enemy. They had been trained to fight horrors that had lain dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as they ventured into the forbidden zone, they would discover that some places are best left undisturbed, and some evils are beyond human comprehension. This is the story of Bravo Company, of the terror they faced, and of the jungle that devoured them whole. On October 3, 1968, the men of Bravo Company gathered in the dimly lit briefing room of their base camp, hidden deep within the dense jungles of Vietnam. The tension in the room was palpable as Captain James Jim Holloway addressed his team. The flickering overhead lights did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere, and the faces of the men were shadowed, reflecting the unease they all felt. "Listen up," Captain Holloway began, his voice steady despite the weight of the mission he was about to outline. "Intelligence has confirmed increased Viet Cong activity in a remote area of the jungle, a place locals have dubbed the Forbidden Zone. Command wants us to move in, gather intel, and, if possible, disrupt any enemy operations we find. This won't be an easy mission. The terrain is uncharted, the jungle is dense, and we'll be moving in complete silence. No one else has ventured that deep into the jungle and returned alive. Anyway." As he spoke, the men exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard the rumors about the Forbidden Zone, a place where entire patrols had disappeared without a trace, where the jungle seemed to swallow men whole. But these were seasoned soldiers, men who had faced death on the battlefield and survived. They weren't about to let ghost stories rattle them, or so they told themselves. Sergeant Frank Miller, a grizzled veteran with a permanent scowl, shifted in his seat and muttered under his breath, "Sounds like another suicide mission?" Captain Holloway caught his eye and nodded grimly. "It might be, Sergeant, but this is our job. We move out at dawn on October 5th, pack light, bring extra ammunition, and be ready for anything." On the morning of October 5th, Bravo Company set out into the jungle. The humidity was suffocating, and the dense foliage quickly closed in around them, swallowing the path they had cut through. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying vegetation, and the only sounds were the soft crunch of their boots on the ground and the occasional distant call of a jungle bird. But even those sounds grew less frequent as they ventured deeper into the jungle, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press down on them. The men moved in a single file, their senses heightened, every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch putting them on edge. Private Tommy Lawson, the youngest member of the team, glanced nervously at the twisted trees around them. "You guys ever hear the stories about this place?" He whispered to Corporal Davy Ross, who was just ahead of him. Davy turned slightly, his face unreadable in the shadowed light. "What stories?" Tommy hesitated, then continued in a hushed voice. "The locals say this jungle is haunted, that there are spirits of soldiers who died here, both American and Viet Cong, and they don't like anyone trespassing on their territory. They say men go mad in these parts, driven insane by the voices of the dead." Davy snorted softly, trying to mask his unease. "Just stories, Tommy. We're soldiers, not kids. Ghosts aren't real." But despite his dismissive words, the unease in Davy's voice was clear. As they continued their march, the jungle seemed to grow darker, the trees thicker, the path more treacherous, and the further they went, the more disoriented they became. The map Captain Holloway had been given seemed increasingly useless. Paths that should have led to clearings looped back into the dense forest, and landmarks they had marked simply vanished. By the third night, the unease had settled deep into the bones of every man in Bravo Company. They set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by the oppressive darkness of the jungle. The campfire flickered weakly, barely illuminating the men's faces as they sat in a circle, each lost in his own thoughts. Private Jimmy Bones Thompson, a wiry soldier with a nervous energy, was the first to speak. "Anyone else hear those whispers last night?" he asked, his voice low. Sergeant Miller looked up sharply. "What whispers?" Bones hesitated. "I don't know, it sounded like voices, but not in English. Could have been the wind, I guess, but it didn't sound right." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Captain Holloway, who had been staring into the fire, finally spoke up. "We're all on edge, hearing things that aren't there. This jungle messes with your mind. Stay focused on the mission." But as they settled down to sleep, the whispers began again. This time, they were louder, more distinct, and impossible to ignore. They seemed to come from all around them, echoing through the trees, speaking in a language none of them understood. The shadows cast by the firelight danced and flickered, taking on strange shapes that seemed almost human. The men lay wide awake, their hands gripping their rifles, eyes darting around in the darkness. Davy, who had been on the brink of sleep, sat up suddenly. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Tommy nodded, his face pale. "I saw something out there in the trees. A figure. It was watching us." Captain Holloway's jaw tightened. "Stay sharp, everyone. We'll double the guard tonight." But sleep was impossible. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to close in on them. The air was thick with tension, and the oppressive heat made it hard to breathe. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent them into a state of heightened alert, their hearts pounding in their chests. By the fifth day, Bravo Company was deep within the heart of the Forbidden Zone. The jungle had grown even denser, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The path was treacherous, and they moved slowly, every step a battle against the tangled undergrowth and their own mounting fear. The jungle itself seemed to be alive, closing in around them, suffocating them with its darkness. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional scream of an unseen animal or the distant, eerie calls that echoed through the trees. The men were exhausted, both physically and mentally, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. Sergeant Miller, who had always been the rock of the team, began to crack. He muttered to himself, his eyes wide and unfocused, as if he were seeing things that weren't there. "They're watching us, waiting for us to slip up." Captain Holloway tried to keep his team together, but even he was beginning to feel the strain. The jungle played tricks on his mind. Shadows shifted in the corner of his vision, and the whispers had taken on a haunting familiarity, as if they were the voices of the men he had lost in battle, calling out to him. That night, as they huddled around a dying fire, the atmosphere was thick with fear. Tommy, unable to bear the tension any longer, spoke up. "Captain, maybe we should turn back. This place, it's cursed." Before Holloway could respond, the jungle erupted in a chorus of whispers, louder and more insistent than ever before. The men jumped to their feet, their rifles at the ready, but there was nothing to shoot at, just the oppressive darkness and the shadows that danced just out of reach. And then, without warning, Tommy bolted into the jungle, his scream echoing through the trees. The men called after him, but he was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. They searched for hours, but all they found were his boots, neatly placed at the base of a massive, ancient tree, its bark scarred with strange, unnatural symbols. The loss of Tommy shook the men to their core. They were now 7, but it felt as if they were already ghosts, doomed to wander the jungle forever. The mission, once so clear, now seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the oppressive presence of the jungle and the malevolent forces that seemed to inhabit it. On the 7th day, as they pushed deeper into the Forbidden Zone, they came across an abandoned Viet Cong camp. The tents were torn, the supplies scattered, and the ground was stained with dark, dried blood. But there were no bodies, just the same eerie silence that had followed them since the start of their journey. Corporal Davy, who had been the most skeptical of the group, now looked around with wide, frightened eyes. "This isn't right, they didn't just leave. Something took them." The men quickly searched the camp, but there was no sign of life, no indication of what had happened to the soldiers who had once occupied it. The only clue was a tattered journal they found in the remains of a tent, written in Vietnamese. As Captain Holloway leafed through it, his face grew pale. "They were hearing the whispers too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They saw things, ghosts of the men they'd killed. And then, one by one, they disappeared, just like Tommy." The revelation shook the men to their core. The jungle was no longer just a battleground. It had become a living, breathing entity, one that was determined to consume them. As the shadows lengthened and the sky darkened, Captain Holloway knew they had to make a decision. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice firm but tinged with desperation. "This mission is over. We need to survive." The men nodded in agreement, but the way out was not so simple. The jungle seemed to shift and change with every step they took. Paths that should have led them back twisted in on themselves, leading them deeper into the heart of darkness. The whispers grew louder, now unmistakably in English, calling out their names, recounting their worst fears, their deepest regrets. Sergeant Miller, already on the brink of madness, finally snapped. He turned on his comrades, his eyes wild with fear. "You're all in on it, aren't you? You're trying to drive me mad. But I won't let you. I won't let you." Before anyone could stop him, Miller raised his rifle and fired into the darkness, screaming incoherently. The others tackled him to the ground, trying to calm him, but it was too late. The jungle had claimed another victim. As they restrained him, Miller's eyes rolled back in his head, and he went still, a chilling grin frozen on his face. The men knew they were running out of time. They pushed on through the night, their nerves frayed, their energy depleted. The jungle closed in around them, the shadows growing thicker, the air colder. It was as if the jungle itself was squeezing the life out of them. By the time dawn broke, only 3 men remained: Captain Holloway, Corporal Davy Ross, and Private Jimmy Bones Thompson. They stumbled into a small clearing where the jungle finally seemed to relent, giving them a brief respite. But the respite was short-lived. As they huddled together, trying to catch their breath, a thick fog began to roll in from the jungle, enveloping them in its cold embrace. And from within the fog, the figures emerged, ghostly apparitions of the men they had lost, their eyes hollow, their expressions filled with sorrow and accusation. The ghosts moved silently, surrounding the men, who raised their rifles in a futile attempt to defend themselves. But there was nothing to shoot at, only shadows and mist. The whispers returned, now louder than ever, echoing inside their heads, driving them to the brink of insanity. Captain Holloway, his mind shattered by the horrors he had witnessed, dropped to his knees, his hands covering his ears as if trying to block out the voices. "It wasn't my fault," he cried out. "I did what I had to do." But the ghosts did not relent. They closed in on the remaining soldiers, their cold, spectral hands reaching out, pulling them into the fog. Davy and Bones tried to resist, but it was no use. The jungle had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many others before. As the fog thickened, swallowing the last of the men, the jungle fell silent once more. The whispers faded, the shadows receded, and the Forbidden Zone returned to its eerie stillness. The only evidence that Bravo Company had ever existed was a single boot, left behind in the clearing, slowly being consumed by the encroaching undergrowth. Weeks later, a search team was sent to locate Bravo Company. They found nothing but the abandoned boot, partially buried in the dirt. The men were declared missing in action, presumed dead, another casualty of the Vietnam War. But the locals knew better. They knew that the Forbidden Zone had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many others. And so the story of Bravo Company became another ghost story, whispered among soldiers and locals alike. A tale of men who ventured too far into the darkness, and of the jungle that never let them go. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.